Hello, I'm Faisal Pervez, a South Asia analyst at Stratfor, and this podcast is brought to you by Stratfor Worldview, the world's leading geopolitical intelligence platform. Individual, team, and enterprise memberships are available at worldview.stratfor.com/subscribe.
He was not your typical kidnapper. He was a very smart man, and as I discuss in my author's notes at the end of the book, he did a good job planning, but things didn't go so well for him, and he didn't seem so smart by the time you get to the end of the book.
Welcome to the Stratfor podcast, focused on geopolitics and world affairs from Stratfor.com. I'm your host, Ben Sheen. One of the security issues we've explored in great detail here at Stratfor over the years, and continue to watch closely with our Threatlands team, is the kidnapping threat to high net worth individuals. In this episode of the podcast, we turn back the clock and take a look at one of the early and very high profile kidnapping cases in US history with author Philip Jett. Stratfor Chief Security Officer Fred Burton sits down with Jett to discuss his book, The Death of an Heir, Adolph Coors III and the Murder That Rocked an American Brewing Dynasty. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, I'm Fred Burton here with Philip Jett, who has written a great book called The Death of an Heir, Adolph Coors III and the Murder That Rocked an American Brewing Dynasty. It was published by St. Martin's Press. Philip, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Fred, thank you very much for having me.
Philip, I read this book, and having been a former special agent and worked kidnapping cases, I was overwhelmed with how good this book was, especially with the tick-tock of a kidnapping and one that took place in 1960. I know from my own research and doing books from predominantly the 70s how difficult it is. So first, what made you want to write about the kidnapping of Adolph Coors?
Well, it's funny, how things happen. I was out in Colorado. I go out there a couple times a year, snow ski, and I fly fish. And I took the tour at the Coors Brewing Company. I don't know if you've ever done that in Golden.
I have, yeah.
And I love it because they give you free beer at the end. And, so on the way out, there's a hallway, and they have a lot of photos from the beginnings all the way to the present of the Coors Brewing Company with all the Coors family members. And so I'm walking along looking, and I get to, the 50s, 60s, and the three sons, Ad Coors III, his brothers Bill and Joe Coors, and I noticed that Ad Coors disappeared from the wall, and that intrigued me. I don't know why, it just did. And so when I was staying at the Golden Hotel, and I went over there and I Googled Ad Coors III, and I found the story. And I'm like, that's a really good story. I haven't heard that. I've never heard that story. And the next thing I did almost immediately was I plugged it into Amazon to see if anyone had ever written a book. And no one had. And I'm like, okay, well, this is it. So that's how it happened. It was just kind of a strange situation, but I recognized the story immediately as what I thought would be a solid story.
Well, you really have done a great job. I was fascinated with the amount of detail that not only do you have footnoted, but the academic research, the investigative work, that the gumshoe work to put the case together. And just having worked cases like this in the past, there were certain things that leaped out at me, such as the data point that you had in there that 30 years before the kidnapping of Ad Coors, Mr. Coors' name had surfaced on a list to possibly be kidnapped. And my question, Philip, in looking at this, why was the fixation on kidnapping Ad Coors? Was it because of the wealth that these individuals had in that time period? But the bad guys, are looking at people to try to kidnap in these days of gangsters and Tommy guns and so forth. going back that far, but any supposition on your part with why they were fixated on brewers?
I think at that time, as I recall, that was 1933, not long after the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. And in Colorado, it's funny, just taking it on a state-by-state basis, the kidnappers in Colorado, there were only a few people of great wealth. In fact, Adolph Coors Jr. Was one of them, but he had a best friend who was even wealthier than him, and he was kidnapped. And Adolph Coors Jr. was due to be kidnapped, but escaped that plot. So I think it was more simplistic. And in fact, the kidnapper that kidnapped Adolph Coors Jr.'s friend became the first public enemy number one, I always thought that was interesting. He was the first number one public enemy. But I think it was more simplistic. I think it was just, they had the money and they were well known in the area. And kidnappings back then, unlike today in the U.S., were, pretty prevalent. And it was before all this technology we have. You just grab somebody, hop in a car, and take off. And so I think that's what it was. And that's what happened with Adolph Coors III. The person who kidnapped him had escaped prison from California. He goes to Denver, and he's looking for easy money. And he finally comes up with the idea to kidnap someone. Well, the short list, a Coors is on the short list, and he chose Coors for whatever reason in his mind, but it's primarily because he was a wealthy family.
That's very interesting. And I know from just dissecting these kinds of cases and looking at it from an attack cycle or from a criminal attack cycle perspective, there's a phase called pre-operational surveillance, which you go into in great detail in The Death of an Heir, which to me as a practitioner and a former agent, I find most interesting because you discuss in the book and how the kidnapper went about doing the surveillance, which there's a tremendous amount of takeaways from the case from 1960 that I even think resonate today as to how kidnappers and bad guys pick their targets. And when you look at this kidnapper that did the abduction of Ad Coors at the time, who was the CEO of Coors, correct?
Yes, CEO, chairman of the board.
He was a little bit different. This was a guy that had been in college and a Fulbright scholar, correct?
That's correct. That was one of the things that troubled the FBI and Mrs. Coors, Ad Coors III's wife. You tend to stereotype these folks, and you expect them to have a long criminal rap sheet and maybe some tattoos and, be a scar here or there. But he was very professional looking, well-spoken, well-educated, had an IQ that tested out at 148, was a Fulbright scholar, and, things went awry for him. And so he was not your typical kidnapper. He was a very smart man, and as I discuss in my author's notes at the end of the book, he did a good job planning, but things didn't go so well for him, and he didn't seem so smart by the time you get to the end of the book.
Right. Well, he certainly had the wherewithal to pull this off. And what I also find interesting is here you have the emergence of the FBI under Hoover that recognized immediately that this was a case they needed to jump in on. And I think you painted a very good picture of the local and state turf issues that surfaced surrounding the kidnapping. And one of the other things that I data mined out of it, which struck me as very interesting, I actually chuckled, was the FBI labeled this case Cornap, obviously for Coors and then the kidnapping. And one of the cases that I worked in the 80s was called Lebnap. And so I picked that out. So that kind of detail to me was just absolutely fascinating.
We'll get back to our conversation with Fred Burton and author Philip Jett in just one moment. But if you're interested in learning more about evolving kidnapping risks, We'll include some related links to Stratfor analysis in our show notes. If you're not already a Stratfor Worldview member, you can learn about individual, team, and enterprise memberships at worldview.stratfor.com/subscribe. We'll also share a link to the recording of a Stratfor Threat Lens webcast with Fred Burton and VP of Tactical Analysis Scott Stewart discussing the threat of high-value target kidnappings to executives and their families. And if you're interested in reading Philip Jett's book, The Death of an Heir, Adolph Coors III and the Murder That Rocked an American Brewing Dynasty, you'll find that link in our show notes as well. Now, back to our conversation with Stratfor's Fred Burton and Philip Jett.
In the course of doing this, Philip, what's the one thing that you uncovered that totally surprised you?
Oh my, that's a good, I have never been asked that question. I guess the thing that surprised me the most was when I finished everything, I was surprised that the kidnapper did such a poor job of covering his trail. It took a long time for the FBI to find him, but it seemed like once things went wrong, he fell apart. And I thought, as I was researching him on the front end, I felt like, this is a smart guy, cool customer. Everyone said he was cold-eyed and unemotional, but the thing that surprised me the most was how he did things that one of my teenage sons probably would know better. Although sometimes I wonder, but I think that was the most surprising thing to me. And I mentioned that at the end of the book is he did such a really poor job. He didn't change his alias. He didn't change his appearance. He would still, when he would sign forms to, get a job or to get in a boarding house, he would use his alias and he would use his last place of residence. And, that's not what you typically do when you're trying to cover your trail.
Without a doubt. And the other thing to me that stepping back, being a product of having been born in the 50s, was looking at Ad Coors on the morning of his abduction, was driving that 1959 white over turquoise International Harvester travel all. I think
I love that
would be
vehicle.
I love that vehicle too. I'd love to try to get my hands on one today. Were you able to figure out what happened to that victim's car?
I never tracked that to see where it ended up. I must digress. I met my son recently over in East Tennessee in Knoxville, and we went over to Gatlinburg and we went into some kind of museum they have there about crime. And they had OJ's Bronco there. I'm thinking of all the places in the world for OJ's Bronco to end up. It ended up in the museum outside of Knoxville. So, I have no idea where this vehicle ended up, but that's a good question. Now you may have sparked something in me, and I'll have to go try to locate it.
I'm just curious. I had a similar kind of case and book from the 70s, and I looked forever for the car, and I was not able to find it. I think it ended up on an auction block somewhere, and Lord knows where from there. But that was such a unique kind of vehicle. I was just curious if it went back to the Coors family or if it ended up in a museum.
Yeah. No, when I did my research, I pulled up the vehicle. Of course, I had photos of the actual vehicle, but I also pulled up photos, from auctions like Meekham's auctions and things like that to see other vehicles that were very similar. And I wanted to see the interior. I wanted to see the seat cushions. I wanted to see the dashboard, everything, so I could just get the feel of that vehicle. And, I drove a Land Rover for a long time, and I just love those kind of vehicles.
And the selection point for the kidnapping struck me as there's a brilliance and simplicity with how the actual kidnapping took place, not only the pre-operational surveillance of Mr. Coors, but how the kidnapper chose that bridge for this to take place on. And the ruse operation was brilliant in many ways to things kind of went south. I won't spoil it for those of you that haven't read the book yet, but to me, that was a good choice of where to carry out this kidnapping.
It was, and it happened by accident. He he'd spent 2.5 years doing his surveillance and planning, and he initially had planned to kidnap Ad Coors in Denver because the Coors family had lived in a nice subdivision there in Denver. And during his surveillance, I'm assuming he saw a moving van one day, and they had moved out to a little area called Morrison, south of Denver, and built a house on a ranch. And so he had to scrap, all of his surveillance and start over. And so, he's out in this remote area watching Coors movements. And it so happened that a stretch of highway that Adolph Coors drove every day got closed for construction. So the detour took them along this little desolate lane gravel road that crossed a one-lane bridge. So he recognized, the kidnapper recognized this was his opportunity.
The family of the kidnapper, I'm struck as I read your story that clearly the father of the kidnapper is really struggling with what went wrong here, and a loving dad that finds it hard to believe for a while that his son has done this. But any sense on your part as to what caused the kidnapper to initially get so violent, engage in that first murder?
I couldn't find anything definitive. In fact, the kidnapper had murdered someone in California. I think he was 21, 22 years old at the time, his first murder. And they got psychiatrists to review him. They interviewed people in college, his professors, and they just said something seemed to have snapped in him. But during my research, I found that even when he was a youngster, he was shoplifting and doing things that were pretty dangerous. And as one of his friends said, he even said, he wondered how it would feel to kill someone. I'm not so sure it was snapping or he just came of age. The one thing that happened during that time period was his mother died and fell from a second-story balcony there at home. And the kidnapper was the only one home with her. And there's a part of me that suspects that he pushed her, but I don't know that for sure. Just based on some statements that I saw, he either felt very guilty about it because he was supposed to repair the balcony, or he may have done more. It's difficult to tell. But to answer your question, what truly happened in his mind, only he knew.
The fact that he did not get the death penalty and he is eventually let out of prison and is living this obscure life for a while until the end, to me, is also fascinating.
Oh, yeah. Today we tend to think, you kill someone, especially someone important, you're going to be in prison for life more than likely, or you may be paroled when you're very old. And I was shocked that the term of sentence he served. In Colorado at that time, in order to get the death penalty, you had to have an eyewitness or a confession. And there wasn't an eyewitness, and he was not going to confess. He wasn't that stupid. So he was given a life. It's funny, they said life sentence at hard labor. Well, he wasn't doing any hard labor. And he ended up being paroled only after about 16 years. And the Coors family and the governor came out and, put pressure on the parole board, so they rescinded it. But he was again paroled the following year. And so he served only about 18 years. And so when he walked out the door for the last time, he was 50 years old and just stayed there in Denver and lived in Denver. I have heard from many sources, I don't think I put this in the book, that the Coors family kept an eye on him. They never did trust him for the rest of his life.
Yeah, and not surprising that they would be concerned about an individual like this that had been engaged in such violent actions. And the one takeaway, and I know this myself, Philip, from just talking to victims over the years from various terrorist attacks and events and so forth, that clearly this event devastated the Coors family.
It did. It did. And it still lingers to this day. My father died when I was very young and in a tragic situation. And, for me, people will say something to me. They'll say, "Oh, I'm sorry," and I'm like, well, for me, it's almost as old as the pyramids. It's just happened so long ago. But for the Coors family, it's funny, having talked to friends of the family and having communicated with one of the Coors, it's still very difficult for them after all these years. And it was certainly difficult at the time. And Mrs. Coors, Ad Coors III's wife, she never recovered, as you'll see in the book. And, she became an alcoholic and she ended up dying younger than she should have. And she loved her husband and they had a good family. When he was kidnapped, they had 4 children at home, ages 10 to 18. And so they had a very good life going out there in Colorado. And, it was snatched away one day by this guy that nobody had ever heard of before.
Wow. I know. I can only imagine the devastation inside the family and just from a corporate security perspective, looking at this kind of case from the long term. And if there's any takeaway from these kinds of horrific events, though, Philip, is folks like you and me and others in the business of keeping people alive and trying to protect high net worth families or those that are in the spotlight every day. You've done a great service in putting this book together, in my assessment, because there's so many different things buried in the story that can be used from a proactive perspective to try to keep people alive. So, I applaud you for their efforts there. And I know that's probably not your motivation for why you did the book, but as I read it, I took away several things that I took notes about and shared with our analysts here at Stratfor.
Well, that's great. No, you're correct. That was not my intention in writing the book. Although as I wrote the book, there would be facts that would come out and I would be like, that's interesting. I'd never really thought about that before. And as a danger or as, a sign that something might be amiss. So that was certainly a benefit from the book. But my main intent, of course, was to tell the story. But also I tried very hard to tell it in a way that would bring light to what the family dealt with, and particularly Mrs. Coors, the wife of the victim. I wanted people to understand how difficult it was for someone like her. And, one of the, you mentioned asked earlier what the surprising thing, you're very familiar with this. I was not, I hadn't really given any thought, but it's just the idea of all the extortionists that come out of the woodwork and, piggyback onto a kidnapping situation. And I've since learned that that's very common. But in her case, and she would have to answer the phone every time someone called. So every fake kidnapper wanting money to extort money, she would have to talk to them. And I thought, how torturous that would be when you're waiting to hear from the real kidnapper about, your husband's condition and when you can get him home, that you have to deal with these other people. To me, that was just very sad and cruel thing.
Yeah, I can't imagine the torture that she had to put up with and dealing with that. And then, to me, the historic development of the FBI handling this kind of notorious kidnapping is clearly one for the ages. And I think what you've done too is shine a good spotlight on. Of course, everybody's heard about the infamous Lindbergh baby kidnapping, but this case was certainly from that kind of national stature right up there. And then, the fledgling FBI and Hoover recognizing that this is something that he needed to jump on and get the G-men involved, to me was interesting, just from that federal law enforcement combating kidnapping in this era.
Right. It was that was another thing I found interesting, was that since the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, this was the biggest kidnapping case the FBI had been involved in. More manpower, more resources than had ever taken place. And what blew my mind was that to have been, such a big case. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover said that the kidnapper was the most wanted man since John Dillinger, that this story just disappeared, to have been such a huge manhunt. Because what I've found is when you look in history from kidnappings in the U.S., you've got Lindbergh, Kidnapping. Everybody, knows Patty Hearst. And now we've got the movie about J. Paul Getty's grandson. And, Frank Sinatra Jr. is in there somewhere. Some people, they know those, but they'd never heard of this one. And this one really was bookended by Lindbergh and Patty Hearst. And the fact that it was just lost, to history, I'm proud. One thing I'm proud of is that I was able to unearth it and bring it to light.
Well, Philip, you should be. I think that you did a great job with this story, and I appreciate the fact that you've taken the time to chat with me today about it. And again, for our listeners that are interested in this story, it's called The Death of an Heir, Adolph Coors III and the Murder That Rocked an American Brewing Dynasty. And it's published by St. Martin's Press. I would encourage you all to read it. And I'm sure, like all authors, Philip would love to have some feedback on the story. And thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Well, thank you, Fred. It's been a real pleasure, and I appreciate your time and particularly the kind words coming from someone with your past experience, and it's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you so much.
And that wraps up another episode of the Stratfor podcast. If you'd like to read Jett's book on the kidnapping and murder of Adolph Coors III, we'll include a link in the show notes. And you can learn more about Jett at philipjett.com. We'll also share links to some related analysis on Stratfor Worldview, as well as a recorded webcast briefing with Stratfor Threat Lens's Scott Stewart and Fred Burton discussing the threat of high-value target kidnappings to executives and their families today. If you're a Worldview member, you can continue this conversation in our members-only forum, and a full transcript of this conversation is available on our podcast page. If you're not already a member, be sure to visit us at worldview.stratfor.com/subscribe to learn more about individual, team, and enterprise level access. And if you have a moment, consider leaving us a review of the podcast on iTunes or wherever you subscribe. Or if you'd like to reach us directly with a question or an idea about a future episode of the podcast, you can email us at podcast@stratfor.com or give us a call at 1-512-744-4300, extension 3917 to leave a message. We always appreciate your feedback. Thanks once again for joining us, and for more geopolitical intelligence, analysis, and forecasting that reveal the underlying significance and future implications of emerging world events, follow us on Twitter @Stratfor.